Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We are so excited to kick off Frist Arts Fest this morning with a conversation with Senior Curator Katie Dalmay and Multiplicity artist Tschabalala Self. But before I turn things over to them, I'd like to thank our supporters of Multiplicity, Blackness, and Contemporary American Collage. Platinum sponsor HCA Healthcare TriStar Health, supported in part by a major grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, leadership support provided by Drs. Turner and Phylance Nash, supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Nissan Foundation, Ameriprise Financial, and the Frist Picasso Circle. Hospitality sponsors the Union Station Nashville Yards and the Grand Hyatt Nashville. Education and community engagement supporter the Wingate Foundation, and Spanish translation sponsor the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Vanderbilt University. If you haven't had a chance to see Multiplicity yet, I hope you'll visit the galleries after today's talk, and I also hope you'll stick around for all the activities we have planned around the building for Frist Arts Fest. Now, please join me in welcoming Katie Dalmay and Tschabalala Self.
Thank you, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. I am so honored to have the opportunity to speak with truly one of the brightest stars in the art world today. Tschabalala Self was born and raised in Harlem, in New York. She attended Bard College for her undergrad and Yale School of Art for her MFA. Her work has been included in so many exhibitions in the US and Europe, too many to say here, but a few highlights include solo shows at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the ICA in Boston, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Frye Museum of Art in Seattle. She's been a resident at the American Academy in Rome and the Studio Museum in Harlem, and her work is in the collection of many prestigious private and museum collections, including the Guggenheim, which was good enough to lend one of your works for our show. But in addition to this very illustrious CV that I've just hit a few highlights, I'm really excited to speak to Shaba this morning because I'm not even sure she knows what an important role she played in the development of Multiplicity. So I'm going to share a little bit of the origin story of the show for you all and for Shaba as well. So some of you have heard already that I had been thinking about organizing a group show on Black portraiture since 2013 when we hosted the exhibition 30 Americans. 30 Americans, as you may know, featured the work of Kehinde Wiley, Mickalene Thomas, Barclay Hendricks, and Carrie James Marshall. A lot of great portraits were in the show. But I knew that that was way too broad of a theme, that I needed to think something, develop something a little bit more narrow. And then in 2018, I was in Miami for Art Week, and I saw for the first time the work of Deborah Roberts, Jamia Richmond Edwards, and Tschabalala Self at the Rubel collection. One of your bodega works was the one that really stuck out to me. And I kind of had that aha moment of, oh, collage, these artists are working in collage to create their portraits. And so as I then, after that light bulb moment, I was doing my research, really looking into, why are so many great artists working in collage today? And I wondered, is it an expression or a reflection of the fragmentation of our times, or is it somehow about violence in the act of cutting or ripping the materials? And as I read and as I spoke to artists, I read two quotes by you that I'm going to repeat now that really became kind of the underlying premise of the show. You talk about how collage represents one individual having many parts, one individual being made from lots of different distinct elements. Then also you are the sum of your experiences, but you also absorb all of the different ideas and experiences of others. And my process mimics this phenomenon. So Shaba, from the beginning, you really have been such an important part of this exhibition. Thank you for participating in the show, and thank you for being here today to speak with us about your practice. I'm really excited. I'm wondering if we could just start maybe by having you speak a little bit about the two works in our show, Spree Will, which is on the screen now, and then Old Bay. Maybe just tell us what we're looking at and maybe speak to how they intersect with your larger practice.
Thank you, Katie, for the introduction. And yeah, I did not know that about the show, but I'm very thankful to have, been an inspiration for the show. It's an amazing show. It's a great opportunity for me to have my work be put in context with a lot of peers and a lot of idols of mine as well. So the painting Old Bay is actually very much related to the painting Milk Chocolate that you would have seen at the Rubel Museum a couple years ago. So it's actually the same character, the figure in both works, and I rarely work in that way, kind of depicting the same exact figure, but in Old Bay and Milk Chocolate, and one other painting called Nate the Snake, it's the same figure. So she's kind of a reoccurring character in my work, and I still don't quite know what her meaning is, but I always know like when I want to invoke her for a particular work. But Old Bay is a work that I think kind of bridges two projects. One.
Could we get Old Bay on the screen by any chance?
Yeah. No problem.
That would be helpful.
Yeah. One being my Bodega Run series, and another series that I'm currently working on, which is kind of like Homebody, which is kind of a look into the significance of the home and the domestic space. So in Old Bay, you see a figure, like a nude female figure in her kitchen, and she has like around her these different products that she would have purchased at the bodega. One in particular being a can of beans, and the name of this bean company is La Morena. And I remember always seeing these beans like at the corner store growing up, and I always thought it was interesting, just given like the name of the beans and kind of meaning like the dark woman or the black woman, and then looking at that in relation to the kind of the portrait of the figure on the can. So La Morena obviously has like a different meaning in depending on what like Spanish-speaking country you're in, but it usually means someone who is like a darker complexion or has darker features, hair, eyes. But it's also something that people would say in the neighborhood. Like where I grew up in Harlem is very mixed. It's like, well, very mixed between like Black Americans and Dominican Americans. Something also people would call like black women in the neighborhood, like La Morena. And then, if you go to bodega, you call the guy who owns bodega Papi. It's kind of a way to kind of bridge this cultural gap amongst people, different kinds of black people within the African diaspora that have different experiences but live in the same metropolitan space in New York. And that series, Bodega Run, really looked into that. It really looked into the nuances of black identity within Black America. So it was an investigation into identity politics or race, but within the vacuum of blackness, not in relation to whiteness, which I think is the general way in which racial conversations are framed. I thought in some ways it was more interesting to have a conversation about all the intricacies of black identity, especially in a metropolitan space that exists just within the vacuum of blackness. Because I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, which isn't often discussed, or there's not really often a lot of room to even discuss that. So something similar I think is happening even with this show, kind of thinking about multiplicity within blackness, not defining blackness in relation to something that is perceived as being outside of itself. So that's kind of a little bit of a backstory on Old Bay and the series that it was first coming out of. And then the painting Spree Well was made specifically for a show I did in 2020 at Eva President Hoover Gallery in New York, and that show was called Cottonmouth. And in that show, I was doing kind of another investigation into identity politics, but at this time, I wanted to really focus on Black American identity and kind of look at it through the lens of popular culture. I was thinking about the importance of oral history in general within the African diaspora and trying to place, like, what is the oral history that exists for Black Americans, and I kind of landed on the idea that the oral history that exists for our community is mostly rooted within popular culture, and its relationship to celebrity culture, music, entertainment, like that realm of society. So that painting, Spreewell, is kind of anchored on this memory that I have of everyone for like a moment in time when I was a kid wearing Spreewell jerseys. And this was when he was playing for the Knicks, and he actually had gotten into an altercation with one of his coaches, and he had choked the coach. And I was thinking about that in relation to the sports politics that were happening around 2020 with a lot of the NFL players protesting, and kind of this analogous relationship between, oftentimes you have these athletes who are in these contentious relationships with their coaches or the institutions, these large power structures that exist around them. And I remember a lot of people felt almost galvanized by that incident with Spreewell, because it seemed as if he was, even though it seems as if he was fighting against an oppressor, even though it's a strange way to look at the situation, because he's a rich basketball player, he's famous, he's successful. You would think objectively that people wouldn't first read the situation like that. But I remember just more like kitchen table talk, it being discussed in that context. And I remember so many people just for a couple months, 6 months, three months, everyone in Harlem had like a Spreewell jersey. And I was thinking about that in relation to this topic of oral history, memory, and popular culture. So this painting was inspired primarily by that idea. Then I wanted to bring in some other tropes of popular culture, and the only other one I could think of at the time that related to this figure that I had imagined Spreewell to be, and I kind of named him in my mind. I kind of thought of him almost as like a rogue Negro, like someone that's kind of went off the path, like someone who has kind of gone off script somehow. Yeah, and I thought, oh, well, I want to have this character also wear Yeezys. I feel like Kanye is also that kind of figure. So I thought, I want to conflate, even though in terms of chronology, it doesn't make sense. I want to kind of conflate those two fashion elements and place the two characters in the painting within this domestic space. So that was the inspiration for this work. And right now, I'm just kind of talking through some of the ideas behind all of these paintings. And in terms of technically how this work is made, I'm using a lot of the techniques I generally would use, which is fabric collage. Some of the fabrics are also actually canvas that's washed, dyed, hand-painted, and then sewn back onto canvas. For all the textile elements, I'm always using stitching, because otherwise with glue, it has this corruption to the canvas that kind of prevents it from having this really taut, smooth surface, which I like to have with the paintings. I think it helps the work to just visually engage more with the history of painting. But in a work like Spreewell, I did also have some paper collage elements. There is an example of a photo transfer from the action that's happening in that TV screen. So that was a photograph that was transferred onto paper. That paper was back to the canvas and then sewn back into the canvas. So it's a couple of different elements in all these different works, but each one is rooted in collage.
Wonderful. You covered a lot of ground there. Thank you so much. And I have to admit that I didn't notice the Yeezy shoes, but so I was looking at the work or an image of the work with a younger, more hip person than I, and they knew immediately what those were. So I appreciated that being spotted or pointed out to me. So you've talked about how you sew, and my understanding is that your interest in textiles and sewing was inspired by a variety of influences from Faith Ringgold to your mother. Mm-hmm. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, kind of the role of these elder women in your development of your practice?
Yes, so growing up, my mother, Glinda, I would always see her sewing. She would do it as a hobby because her actual work was like Well, I want to say it was actually very different. This is also interesting. Like my mother, she ran a trade program in Bronx Community College, and it was a training program for people that wanted to join trade unions in New York. And she would only work with people that had encountered some form of youth disenfranchisement. So either extreme poverty, incarceration, they weren't able to finish school, or some situation like that. So oftentimes they would help all of their students get GEDs, and then they would give them training to then facilitate for them to join the unions. So my mother had a lot of contacts actually at all the different unions in New York. So after her students went through the training, she would do special placements for the students within the unions. And so this would have been like the 90s. So she actually did this from like the 80s to the 2000s. So there was still quite a lot of difficulty for people from like marginalized backgrounds to joining the unions. There was some level of racial discrimination, but also just not being in the right group of people to know how to join. So she was very much involved in that. So you can imagine her day life from like 9 to 5 was basically training people to use their hands, use materials, and to kind of elevate themselves through the use of their hands. So she always supported my art because she really saw art itself too as a trade. And this is another reason why she was really insistent that if this is something that I wanted to pursue, that I needed to be like educated in it. Mm-hmm. Was it something that I could kind of just figure out on my own? So I was always pretty serious about going to school for art and going as long as I could in terms of my education with it, because I always treated it as something similar to you would like any other trade. Mm-hmm. And but as a hobby, my mother, she would like to sew. Like she could make clothing, like a full dress from scratch, something that I cannot do. People always ask me that because I sew for the art, but this is literally just the full extent of my sewing ability. But my mother can make anything like curtains, all of that kind of stuff. So I used to always see her do that as just a way to relax and just a way to, something to do on the weekends. So I always had it in the back of my mind as a medium, I guess, as an artistic medium, as a way to express yourself. So in graduate school, when I was working in actually a different vein, I hit a wall with that body of work, and I was really trying to think about how to expand it. And sewing reoccurred to me as like a possibility to bring into my practice. And I didn't know how to sew at that time. I had never learned from my mother, even though she had offered many times to teach me. But I asked a couple of my friends, some of my girlfriends at school, I asked about 3 different ones if they could teach me. They all 3 of them did know how to sew. And then I spent maybe each weekend with one of them. Each one would show me how they used the machine, how to do this, how to do that. And then by the end of those 3 sessions, I was adept enough to just start doing it on my own. And so that's kind of how it came to me. But then obviously after working in the medium for a little bit of time, I wanted to find some way to anchor the work, art, in an art context. So I started searching for other artists that had really made sewing and quilt making, because essentially I feel like this work is also very much tethered to that, a big part of their aesthetic vocabulary. And then the first artist that stood out to me was Faith Ringgold, because I remember she's actually an artist that I've been aware of my whole life, just through her children's books and just through her being kind of like a ubiquitous character, like a creative character in Black American culture. And she's always been in the periphery of my mind, but I didn't really make the connection that she had a fine art practice. But once I realized that, I'm doing a real deep dive into her work. And then over the years, finding other people, I think every year I find another artist that I wasn't aware of that works almost in this vocabulary. I say a couple years ago, Danga McCannon became someone I became aware of. During this trip, I became aware of someone else again that was mentioned to me in graduate school, Alicia Henry. So it's always reoccurring to me, this relationship to quilting, sewing, textiles, and Black American art, especially I would say amongst women artists.
Um, There's another artist in the show, Helena Metaferia, who I think really honors the labor of her mother in her practice, which I think I'm hearing you say that by extension, by including sewing your mother's hobby into your very, successful fine art practice, that it's a way of kind of acknowledging that, and I think that's very special. I also think, I don't want to embarrass you, but I think it's amazing. I had read about how Faith Ringgold was an inspiration for you, and when I went and saw her show at the New Museum, and I saw that you actually sponsored it, I just thought that was an incredible full circle moment. You're an artist that has seen success at a really young age, and I just thought that was a really just very tactile way of giving back, and I thought that was really cool. So just wanted to point that out. So as we've seen in the images that are scrolling, you often feature women in your work, like in Old Bay, and then of course the couple that's in Spreewell. They're usually expressing themselves very confidently and freely. And I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit about why it's important to you to feature Black women specifically in your work, especially in those very, confident and empowered poses?
I've always been particularly interested in depicting Black women because I'm a Black woman primarily, so I think, it's just been my primary interest in terms of the figure or character. And I felt like it's been a way to engage in self-exploration. So I think that's been the primary drive thus far in having Black women be the main subjects of my practice. So that's one part of it. And then the other half of it is that I felt like there was always certain images that were missing. So I love other realms of culture. So I love music, I love films, magazines. I engage with that kind of stuff quite a lot, television shows, all that. But I'm always kind of watching and thinking, oh, this person they're missing a layer, or this character seems a little bit inauthentic, or it's just not quite plausible somehow, or it's not edgy enough. So I thought characters that I always come across in other art mediums, I always felt like were somehow incomplete. So, doing my own paintings, I'm allowed to make these characters I feel like are, more whole, more layered, have more depth to them. And I could put them out in the world, so I feel like I can, kind of put my 2 cents in almost. And something that I realized that I couldn't really fully articulate until I had a conversation with another artist recently is that sometimes for something to be whole, it actually has to not be fully understood even. It has to be a level of nonsense to a person or an object or a scenario for it to be real almost, It can't be over-articulated, it can't really fully reveal itself immediately. So I also try to embed a bit of mystery into my paintings and into all my works, something that's not fully immediately understood. So as much as I can try to contextualize my work with kind of giving you perspective into what was going on in my mind when I was making a painting, that's not to say that that's what the painting is about. The painting is really completed through the viewer's experience and what the viewer brings to the work as well.
I love that kind of sense of mystery, or sparking our own creativity as we interpret it. Is that with the shadows that are sometimes behind your figures? They're not in the 2 works in our show, but I know that there are often kind of these shadowy silhouettes behind many of your figures. Does that play into it, or is that totally different?
Yeah, I feel like the shadows definitely do play into it. It plays into this aspect of the character that cannot be fully known to the viewer, or even possibly to the character themselves. Also, putting the figure within these color fields, which I describe as liminal spaces, also speaks to that. So they're not entirely anchored into any known location. So it leaves the possibility that you are seeing someone in a state rather than in a place.
That makes a lot of sense, and yet I know it seems like the interior for Spreewell especially, it does seem kind of specific. Maybe it's like every living room, or it's meant to evoke just kind of a general sense. But I know domesticity and interior spaces, as you mentioned in your intro, is something that you are very interested in. Can you speak a little bit about your, why that's something that's compelling to you or that you're attracted to?
Well, there are some series where I am very intentionally placing the figures within an environment. One of them was my Bodega Run series. So in all of those works, the figures are very much anchored within a real space. And in any work that depicts the home, again, the figures are within a space. But I think the home can be one of those kinds of sites that is a real space, but it is so packed with, it's so psychologically charged that it almost becomes an abstraction of itself. And I was thinking that way about the bodega. The bodega is so culturally charged that it almost becomes an abstraction of itself, in that when you imagine the space, it actually seems more vast in your imagination than it is in reality, because of all the associations and all the different tangents you can build on. So a home, when you think about a home, your home, the home you grew up in, the home that you want to be in, when you think about what it is, it's actually quite more expansive than what the physical space can contain. So in that way, I feel like it is a real space, but in terms of how it functions in your mind, it becomes an abstraction of itself. So in that regard, it's adjacent to a liminal space, a space that is not a real physical space. So I'm intrigued in spaces like that when I'm going to depict an environment. Another space I feel like could function that way could be a landscape or a pastoral environment. So there are certain spaces that are real locations, but they can easily fall within the psychological realm of being something like abstract.
Well, going back to the physical realm, I had no idea that you had a line of furniture that you were making until we were preparing for this conversation, and I saw some slides of those objects. Like, oh my goodness, that is incredible. Can you tell us about this line? And I'm assuming to a degree it's related to that, aspect of the home, although obviously a more physical manifestation of it.
Yeah, so it's a very small edition of furniture objects, all of which are unique. And I first made these for my Performa commission as props for the for the actors. They were engaging with them, sitting on them. So there's some pictures of that Performa commission in the slide, and the Performa commission is actually a good example of what I was just speaking about. These actors were in a kind of experimental play in which it was like a lover's spat that was being depicted on the stage. And they each had these doublings of themselves, which could be seen as being similar to the shadows or whatnot in the paintings. And I wanted to create this home environment. So this is my interpretation of this real yet imagined interior space. I really wanted the environment to mimic the paintings, not literally in terms of how it looked, but more in terms of how the paintings feel, and really translate that in 3 dimensions. And the furniture elements were a way to, I guess, bring home the idea that these figures were within a domestic space. And they were really successful for the purpose of the play, but they also just became important to me outside of the play. I thought that they became really beautiful ways to, I guess, engage viewers in the exhibition space. They kind of take the role of a museum bench when I have a show, or it's a way for viewers to also engage with the artwork, I guess in a more tangible sense. So if they're looking at a painting of a figure within their home or on a chair, they can sit on one that's similar. So I think it creates this almost like super felt dialogue between viewers and the characters in the works. So they've become, at this point, a big part of my practice, especially in regard to this series, and they function somewhere in between functional objects and sculptures often in the installations.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. Is this furniture that is intended to be seated on? Or is it sculpture on a pedestal? Like, do you want people to interact with them, or are they precious and not to be touched?
I mean, they really are not precious. People are meant to sit on them. They are perfectly functional. Sometimes people are scared to sit on them because they think that they won't work, but they do work as real chairs. And you can sit on them. You're meant to sit on them. You're meant to engage with them. I was thinking a lot too about Franz West's furniture series in regard to these, because he had furniture pieces that, people are meant to use them as much as they like. If the cushions or whatever became damaged, there was a instructions as to how to repair them. I feel similarly about these. They kind of have a logic, each one, to how they're made. So if someone was to have them and wanted to use it for like daily use and it got old at one point, they could redo it in a way that would still be true to the original artwork. So I was kind of thinking a lot about his work in regard to making these.
Okay, they're fantastic. When I saw them, I think I audibly gasped. I was like, oh my gosh, because they work so well with your paintings and then with your performance. I really enjoy them. A little bit more in the utilitarian side, I can't help but think of fashion when I see your paintings. Obviously, all of the fabrics and the patterns, the textiles. Is fashion a source of inspiration for you? Have you ever done a body of work that is more specifically tied to, objects that you would wear, to fashion objects?
I've always been intrigued by fashion because I feel like fashion is a way that people kind of reimagine themselves. So I use this word fashioning a lot also when talking about me making things or me making the figures and the paintings. But I've done some commercial work in regard to fashion. It's not something I think I'm too passionate about, but it is something that I enjoy doing. But fashion, I'm very much inspired by, and I think it's because people have an opportunity to reinvent themselves through the clothes that they put on. And also, I think it too about everything. This quote that from RuPaul, which is really interesting. It says you're born naked and everything else is drag. I think that's really true. I mean, people kind of underestimate how much they seek to communicate to others about who they are or who they seek to be based on how they present themselves. I think this is something that everyone does. Every person, even a person who doesn't consider themselves to be a creative type, every person makes that decision each morning about how they're going to present themselves for a perceived audience through how they're fashioning themselves. So.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of territory already, but I would love to circle back to, we were talking about women and, kind of inserting them into the canon. How do you feel like your work engages with art history? I see that, so often the reclining white odalisque figure from Ingres to Matisse and Manet and many others. Do you feel like your work is really engaging with that, the so-called canon?
Yeah, I feel like my work does engage with the canon. Just because I imagine the canon as being something that's mostly rooted in chronology and what's happening, kind of covering the most influential contemporary art in every moment in time. So I feel like my work engages with the canon in that regard. I'm not an artist that makes it my mission to engage with the canon. I feel like that could be by engaging in that battle. In some ways, I'm conceding to the validity of a conversation I think is ultimately not in my best, not towards the edification of myself or my work, But I do feel like my work does engage in the canon just because I'm making work now in this moment in time. It has a level of influence, and I think it's something that people will continue to think about in the future. So in that way, I feel like the work would be part of the canon. So.
One other question that I had meant to ask a little bit earlier when we were talking about your use of materials and textiles. I know that in Sprewell, for example, the jeans are your own jeans. and that with
Those are Y project pants, which I really liked, but I couldn't fit anymore. I was like,
no.
oh my God, they're
well,
really
at least
expensive.
you did something useful with them.
I reused them, yeah.
Yeah.
So I do love fashion, but yeah.
Well, and so I heard that, and then that a piece of the in the lower right corner of Old Bay, that's actually like your mother's fabric. So it seems like there's a very kind of personal association with many of the materials. Is that a fair thing to say, or could you maybe share some other examples if that is the case?
Yeah, so I guess I can talk more about where the fabric comes from. Some of the fabric is fabric that I go to the store and purchase, but a lot of fabric that's in my paintings is actually fabric that I got from my family's home. My mother collected a lot of fabric, and so did my sisters. They also collected a lot of fabric as well. So in my family's home, I actually had like these bags full of textiles. So a lot of the pieces too are from this family collection of fabric. And then other fabric objects or things that come from my own life, like the jeans and this painting. Sometimes other bits of textiles are from some old piece of clothing I had, and in that way I say that the paintings, as much as they're related to collage, they're related to quilt making, because I feel like that's an aspect of quilt culture, is to take things that have some kind of symbolic meaning to you and to preserve them through integrating them into this functional object, right, that you can still engage with every day. So I've definitely borrowed a bit of that with my paintings as well, kind of reusing things that have a personal symbolism or meaning and bringing them into the painting. So it's a way to preserve them, as a way to, I guess, canonize these little objects that are important to me in my life. So that's been a really meaningful way to kind of almost diary my own life, just do my work. So.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds like it's a bit of a practical aspect, that it's around and you want to preserve them, but then I like that idea of just diarying your life, or just preserving different aspects of it. How are we doing on time? Tell us about a new direction that it looks like you're going. And also, when we were preparing for this conversation, I noticed that you're working in video, and that seemed like an exciting new territory for you. Is that new, or are you just now presenting it to the public?
Well, the video would have been me still getting to understand the significance of the Performa Commission.
Okay.
So the Performa Commission, because it was a live performance, 3 days, it happened and then it was done. But I have this document from one of the nights, and I've been kind of reorganizing through editing the live performance document and seeing if it could become an artwork. So I've experimented with it as like a 3-channel video with a soundscape. And this is kind of my first foray into video art. And it's really through repackaging and reimagining the commission. But it's something that I would do normally. Kind of, you have one object and then you're cutting it up and rearranging it to create another. So I'm kind of applying a lot of the same tenets I normally would with the paintings to this Performa document.
So still a collage of sorts.
It is, 100%, yeah.
I love that. Well, we have a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Anybody have questions for Shaba? Yeah, I see one in the back. Megan, are we passing mics or, okay.
I can just ask you if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
Outside voice. I'm affiliated with Frye Art Museum in Montclair, New Jersey, and they just had a very large show of Vanessa German. And I'm just curious about, are you in conversation at all with her work? Because I see a lot of conversation, but I'm wondering if that's been kind of like one of your inspirations, or have you drawn anything from her work?
Well, that artist by name, I'm not so familiar with, but if I could see one of their works, I probably have a better sense. But I'm sorry about that.
She works more sculpturally, is my knowledge of her work, Vanessa German. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the sculptures are made, all the sculptures that you would see that are outside are made out of bronze. So those are cast bronze. And then some of the sculptures that you would see inside, you see they're inside of an exhibition space. Some of those are bronze, and then some of those are actually made out of fiberglass, because they're more like prototypes. I'm kind of working my way up to finish thinking about how I want to do them permanently, and then at some later point, they would also be made out of bronze. The bronze is because it's a material that's chosen because it's very durable, lasts for a very long time, and you also have the flexibility of showing it indoors and outdoors. So, yeah.
Got one in the back, then we'll get to you, Kahari. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your work today and coming to speak with us. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Hall. I'm an RCC fellow with the Fisk University Gallery in LACMA in Los Angeles. And I just had a question about how long did it take you to find your specific identifiable style, and how did you know that that was like the style that you were going to go with?
That's a great question. Thank you.
So I kind of touched on that just a little bit earlier. When I mentioned I kind of was hitting this wall in grad school, so my grad school program was 2 years. So I was starting to feel that way after that first year. And up until that point, the kind of work I was making was only really works on paper, and I was really relying heavily on this technique I had become really attached to from undergrad, where I had made these handmade plates, calligraphic plates. So they were made out of a lot of different materials. Sometimes they were actually old paintings that were cut out. Sometimes they were cardboard, lots of different stuff. They were all glued together. I would ink up these plates, and I would print them on the printing press, like a regular intaglio printing press. And they were really successful. This is the body of work I used to apply to grad school with. And they were beautiful works, but it had some limitations, with one being on paper. The scale was completely dictated by the press. And when I tried to scale up, they became even more fragile, because paper at larger scales even becomes actually more unwieldy. So I was thinking about how to retain what was successful about these, but also like move forward. So in my graduate school program, you have like a lot of critics coming in, your professors. They come in like a couple times a week. So I was kind of talking through this issue with a lot of them, and one of them would mention that you're putting most of your energy into the actual plate making. This is where all your energy is. And so for a while, I just focused on the plate making. So I was making these objects that were shaped. They were just kind of cut out forms, and they were just the plates. But those two didn't really satisfy what I was looking for, because I really wanted to make paintings. I come to this realization that I was a painter, and I wanted to go back to making paintings. So for me to make a painting, it had to be on canvas, had to be on that substrate, it needed to be stretched, needed to have that projection from the wall. I feel like people just reacted viscerally differently to like this kind of object, and in this way, I could engage with a history of painting. I could have those kind of conversations, which I did want to have, particularly at that time. So I was thinking, how can I get these plates onto the canvas, essentially? So then that's when I realized sewing was going to be my most successful means to do that. So I started basically sewing these former calligraphic plates to canvas. The plates were so thick that it wasn't functionally, it didn't make sense. They weren't really able to go through my machine. It was complicated. So fabric became a means to do that, because I could still get this kind of depth of plane within the objects, but the fabric was thin enough so that it can go through the machine. And I knew that this is what I wanted to do, what I wanted to land on, when I realized that I hadn't seen another artist doing these combinations of things. Because it was really important for me to have a language that was unique to me, like a language that people could look at and say, this is like my work, like not anyone else's work. And it's not necessarily doing something that's completely new. It could be a matter of doing a lot of things that were already done, but putting them together in a new way. So just kind of borrowing from many people and reorganizing it in a new way. And again, this idea of gathering things that already exist, but just reorganizing them is, I think, really, really, really interesting. And it has a lot, even just in terms of thinking about collage as conceptual practice. And I think that actually runs throughout like Black culture. Even you think about kind of like hip hop and rap, it's about kind of sampling lots of different things that already exist and rearranging them to create something new. So when I saw something that to me looked like something I hadn't seen before, then I felt like, okay, this is what I want to pursue. So
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. I hate mics, but so my question happens to be on the 2023 work.
yeah.
I have not seen those before. I'm assuming you've probably done work that looks like that before in some fashion. But like, I'm really interested in how you kind of came to this moment of the object of furniture and the body of people, and how they kind of have this space between being one thing and two things kind of combined. And so I was like really interested in like drawing for you specifically, and then also drawing in this type of way where the body of things that are used and then the body of people in one context or another can be maybe something you're talking about or maybe nothing you're talking about at all. I'm like really interested in these mixes of furniture and people where it's like there was a sculpture where it was like a man, his leg was one of the legs of the chair and then he was on top of the chair. So yeah, I just want to ask you a little bit about that, the process of like drawing a lot maybe this year, and then just coming back to kind of drawing and then the paintings that you've been doing.
So, yeah, you're 100% correct in that these sculptures were inspired, and the painting behind it were all came out of a drawing series. So the drawing series was a series I was doing around the same time as the Performa commission. So all the drawings of the furniture objects were actually the original sketches for the furniture designs. And I wanted to find when I was just kind of playing around when doing the script, thinking about what the real significance of the furniture could be. So I wanted to kind of embed these figures within the furniture to kind of activate them. So I was taking these original drawings from the designs, the furniture designs, and just doodling really these characters onto them to kind of imagine like how the actors would engage with the furniture, or what the meaning of their engagement would be. So this original drawing series came out of that. That drawing series inspired these kinds of paintings, which I call leisure paintings. They were meant to look like drawings, but on canvas. So again, this idea of kind of transmuting one medium into another and seeing what can happen there. And then the sculptures, I think, are really the final stage of those drawing series. I feel like the sculptures are kind of the peak realization from that drawing series. And so everything kind of led me there. And now I feel like that series is complete. But the sculptures, again, show these figures embedded or engaging with the furniture objects, the furniture pieces that are, that are real functional art objects. And the concept for the original drawings are really inspired by another drawing series by Louise Bourgeois. I think I'm saying this correctly, but it was like Femme de Maison, or like Woman House. So it's like these drawings of a woman, and she's like embedded in a house. And it's all these different homes and different women. And I imagine it was like a feminist critique or questioning as to like the role of a woman in a house. Is a woman tethered to the house, chained to the house? Is the woman a house? I mean, like, it's like a kind of open-ended question. But like, I wanted to explore the same idea, but do it with both a male and a female character in my own drawing series. And just, it went from the drawings to the paintings and then to the sculptures. I think the sculptures are the clearest and most successful articulation of the original idea. But I do still love the original drawings. So especially the first series, which I don't really have much of here, were really weird. They also fell into this like way, they became abstract in a way that I had almost lost in the applique paintings that I wanted to like return to. So doing that drawing series was really helpful for me as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on your question and ask, as you mentioned the sculptures and the paintings in the back, the leisure paintings, is there a particular reason that they're called leisure paintings? And what's the reason that most of obviously they're interacting with the furniture, but they're all sitting down? Yeah. And you see that big sculpture you saw that's looking out on the sea that was before, was at St. Pancras in London, which the audience, like with the public interacted with a lot. So I thought maybe you could expand a bit on that.
Yeah, so I wanted to have all the figures seated because I feel like a person that's seated seems like they are settled into an environment. There's a certain level of comfort that's implied by that, and a certain level of like familiarity. So having the figures be seated, I thought was significant. Also, the chairs in general are significant because a chair always implies a figure, even if no figure is occupying it. So I'm curious about objects that can be related to figuration but don't show a figure. So for me, a chair is also another investigation into figuration, but without having a physical body. What was interesting, though, is that when these bronze sculptures of the seated figures, when they're placed outside, they take on a really different connotation. Because I think being seated outside, especially to have a black body seated outside, becomes a political statement. Whereas when you have a figure, a black body shown seated in an interior space or a space that's known to be their own, it's not a political conversation. So having this sculpture be outside in the public, I already spoken about it previously in this other location as it being a political gesture just because of the fraught history of black bodies and seats, quite literally. You know, think about, this was never shown in the States, but within the American context, the civil rights movement, kind of black people being prevented from being allowed to sit and occupy public spaces historically and even, you know, in the contemporary moment. But when this sculpture was moved to the second location, the Delaware, it was actually a victim of a violent attack. I mean, it's not a real person, but it was, all of its skin was covered in white paint, and it was actually vandalized in that way. But so even though that was a very upsetting experience, it kind of proved my point that black bodies in public spaces have this inflammatory effect on people for whatever reason. But it ended up being a very positive story in the end because the community rallied to. There was meant to be like a protest to kind of go against the vandalism, but I suggested that we do like a community cleanup day. I thought that would be more cathartic for people that were traumatized by the event. But I thought maybe like 10 or 15 people would show up, but actually 400 people from the community showed up, and each person was able to remove a bit of the white paint that was put on the sculpture, and by the end of the day, all of the paint was removed, and the restorator was able to come in the next day and just restore the work to its former, to its proper look. But so it ended up being actually a really beautiful story at the end, but that is something that this sculpture in particular did experience when at the Delaware Pavilion at Bexhill-on-Sea in the UK. Yeah.
Wow, what a powerful story. That almost becomes an act of performance, a performance.
I know, unintended, but yeah.
Wow.
Ultimately.
Well, maybe we should end on that note. That was a very inspirational way to pull it all together. Thank you so much for being here today, Shaba. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I learned a lot about your practice, and I hope you all did too. And enjoy the rest of your day and the Frist Arts Fest.